find this presentation interesting. As you can see here on the screen, the title of my research is Self-Regulated Learning of Adult EFL Professionals in Chile, Online Classes During the Pandemic. I worked with this research alongside with Professor Masatoshi Sato, who guided all this process. So let's start with some background information first. I would like to mention that distance education has become more and more widespread in Chile. Examples can be seen in higher education courses, as well as courses sponsored by the government that are conducted in online settings. The reason that might explain this slowly growing trend is the constant need of workers to develop their skills in order to basically survive in the professional world. And this constant development of skills throughout one's life is what lifelong learning is basically all about. So in that regard, Peters found similarities between lifelong learning and also distance education, in that both encourage learners to take responsibility for the learning management. And considering the last question on this slide, apparently there is no much literature about Chilean professional adults and their self-regulated learning processes for learning an additional language in online settings. So based on that information, the purpose of this research was to first investigate self-regulated learning processes in adult professionals taking online English classes in Chile, and also to explore the impact of environmental factors, namely the pandemic and the lockdown, on adult professionals' self-regulating learning processes. So let's take a look at the literature that informed this research. And the present study is mostly based on Zimmerman's model of self-regulated learning. Zimmerman defines SRL as the self-generated thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are aimed at achieving goals. There are three phases in this process that, in a very broad sense, are the behaviors that are displayed before, during, and after any kind of learning effort. Other key aspects of self-regulated learning is that it cannot be separated from the context where it takes place and can be affected by the environment. Therefore, it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that the current pandemic can actually affect the way learners display self-regulated learning behaviors, as actually Miniduk forecasted. So moving on to a different point, considering self-regulated learning in online settings, literature suggests that technology may affect the learning management, as it was advanced by Pintrick. And in addition, the bloom of massive open online courses have expanded the notion of what can be considered as a traditional classroom. So before moving on to the next slide, it's important to keep in mind that the current study focused on adults who are studying English, studying English for professional reasons. That is why it's important to consider as well English for the workplace. First of all, Burgos and Molina brought to the fore the importance of ESP, especially for adults, since they are already looking for ways to improve their professional and academic lives. So within ESP, Mara identifies a branch of it that focuses on understanding the language that is created from the interaction of workers in a community of practice. And this is called English for the workplace. This is quite relevant because for Peters and Yates, the workplace has become the new classroom, especially for adults, since reskilling has become a must. This is also the result of a Western notion of workplace, one that is moving towards more service-oriented industries and also flatter organizational charts. In addition, Yates stated that nowadays workers are more likely to face the challenge of communicating in a different language in order to do their jobs. So my next point is self-regulated learning and the current pandemic. So most research on SRL worked with participants that up to some extent had voluntarily chosen online settings for their second language learning. However, that might not be the case when, for example, lockdowns are brought into the equation. Additionally, the pandemic situation can take an enormous toll on people's mental health, making it more difficult to regulate behaviors. So this perspective is further supported by Reeve, since he mentioned that contextual experiences can either encourage or undermine students' engagement in self-regulated behaviors. As it was previously mentioned, SRL cannot be separated from the context. And finally, Harris stated that the sudden shift to online learning settings has forced learners to rethink, adapt, and adjust how they study, adjust their self-efficacy, their expectations, their planning, all concepts that are essential for self-regulated learning. So based on that, these are the two research questions that the present study aimed at answering. The first one is, what self-regulated behaviors do adult EFL professionals display during the pandemic? And two, how do participants' self-regulated learning affect their learning processes? So let's take a look at the methodology from this present study. First of all, a mixed method design was used in order to complement data that might have been overlooked by just implementing quantitative or qualitative research. But for the sake of brevity, this presentation only shows the qualitative design and its results. So for the qualitative stage of this research, participants were asked to write entries for a period of 3 to 4 weeks, and then they were invited to participate in a semi-structured interview. In this case, the participants were all professional adults, and there were two distinct groups. The online group was all the participants that started their learning process during the pandemic in an online setting, and the shift group are the ones who were forced to make the transition from face-to-face classes to online settings because of the pandemic. So the participants of the journals, also called JP, were 12, and 16 participants for the interviews, henceforth IPs. There were 16 of them. Okay, so let me explain how the data collection took place. So first of all, the journals that were used were adapted from the ones implemented by Yabukoshi in her study of self-regulated learning, which was also based on Zimmerman's model. Here, participants were asked to write entries describing their learning activities before, during, and after each online session. And the main reason to implement journals was that observing participants at that time was not really possible due to the pandemic. Therefore, journals provided an excellent opportunity to collect data regarding their self-regulated learning behaviors. So in terms of the interviews, they were adapted from Milligan and Littlejohn's works on self-regulated learning in online learning settings. These interviews consisted of 28 open questions that aimed at gathering relevant information about self-regulated learning processes, such as strategic planning, goal setting, self-efficacy, among others. And more importantly, the semi-structured nature of this script gave an opportunity to include prose. So interviewees could elaborate further on certain topics, such as their context during the pandemic, as you can see here in the underlined question. Well, regarding the qualitative data analysis, a template organizing style was conducted so that clear definitions were established prior to coding, as Dorney suggested, and also promoting the coherence among codes. This template organizing style can be used when there is plentiful background information about the topic, which was the case for self-regulated learning. Well, in order to become more familiar with the data and at the same time recognize potential extracts of interest, Dorney suggested to carry out a pre-coding process. So as interviews were being transcribed, a list of key points was made. Then a second level coding took place in order to find similarities across codes and also cluster them into themes. Well, for the coding scheme, a definition of each self-regulated learning sub-process was established based on Zimmerman's research. For instance, self-efficacy involved any participant's quotes that mentioned their beliefs about having the personal capacity to learn and perform effectively. So let's take a look now at the results, and we'll start with the results from the journals. So here, you can see the frequencies of entries regarding participants' strategic planning for managing their environments in order to facilitate their learning. Strategic planning was the most salient self-regulated sub-process displayed by participants, especially from journals. Examples of this self-regulated behavior are the following. For example, JP5 said that I set up my lab desk on my bed and I start taking my classes. I do this on my bed and not on my desk, so I can separate my environments and be more comfortable. Similarly, JP10 said that I told the people I live with that I would start my class so I don't get interrupted. Similar findings were also included in the interviews. For example, IP9 said that this area here is my office. I come in here when I have a meeting, when I have classes, when I need to focus. But if I want to play on my computer, I took it somewhere else. Another important finding was that participants did not report any kind of self-reflection process in their entries. Well, now let's take a look at the frequencies of self-regulated learning sub-processes found in the interviews. Here you can see the most salient ones, except for self-reflection that I will mention it later. Okay, so quotes from the interviews. For example, most participants presented a clear goal orientation, meaning that the reasons why they decided to study English were very clear, and most of them were connected to their workplaces, as shown in the following quotes. For example, IP1 said, as soon as I was promoted to my current position, I started having meetings in English, contact with people from Australia, USA, and other English-speaking countries. So this is an example of clear goal orientation. However, in terms of the participants' learning objectives, they were too general and vague. For example, IP12 said, I keep the same objective to communicate the best I can. And similarly, IP11 mentioned that I don't have short-term goals. I just keep on practicing so I can achieve more fluency. And in addition, participants pointed out that they didn't feel quite ready to do English-related activities at work. For example, they mentioned that, for example, participant 15 said, I have a hard time trying to have a conversation. And participant number 6 said, there is no way I can hold a conversation with someone. Well, following to the key findings from the interviews, similar to the data collected through journals, interview participants reported that they didn't engage in any kind of behavior that might have promoted their self-reflection. And importantly, some differences in the self-evaluation sub-processes were found between the participants who made a forced transition, the shift group, and the ones who started their classes in an online setting, the online group. Here are two examples. The first one is from the shift group, who said, it's been a bad transition. Before the pandemic, I took the 3 tests that I had every month. Now I'm taking only 2, and I must admit that I've taken a more laid-back attitude. Conversely, participant number 10 said, the online methodology has improved the way I learn, and now I prefer it over face-to-face classes. Another interesting finding was that most participants presented a positive self-evaluation regarding their learning progress, even though their classes had no impact in their performance at work. Participant number 12 exemplified the situation. She said, my classes haven't brought any significant changes to the English I know so far, but later she mentioned the best thing of my classes is the moment when you realize you're learning new things and you are integrating them. So let's discuss these findings. Well, let's talk about the relevance of planning. Participants presented clear goal orientations, which is a key factor for learners' motivation and learners' engagement. However, motivation alone seems not to be enough for developing an efficient self-regulated learning process. This is supported by the distal and vague goals that participants had set and the complete absence of self-reflection behaviors. As a result, participants developed uninformative self-regulated learning iterations that didn't really help them make the necessary adaptations to their learning performance. This finding highlights the role of an external evaluator that might provide guidance on how learners regulate their learning. Regarding self-satisfaction, one question that I asked myself when I was analyzing the data was this one. Why did participants report positive self-satisfaction despite having low levels of self-efficacy at work? So one explanation for this is that the contents of their courses didn't match their professional needs. Moreover, the absence of clear goals might have led them to use more subjective information for their self-evaluation. So this might suggest that participants in the present study didn't consider their low self-efficacy at work, but they turned to more general achievements in order to assess their performance. As a result, participants didn't have enough valuable information to make decisions about whether continuing with no changes or making adaptations to their learning approaches. So regarding the online context and self-regulated learning, the online group was more likely to display behaviors towards adapting their schedule and environment to make their learning more efficient. Focusing now on the shift group, they felt that their expectations were not being met and they didn't feel self-efficacious in managing their online learning. Interestingly, both groups recognized that self-regulation was promoted in online settings. However, for the shift group, they considered it as a burden because they thought they didn't match the learner profile required in online settings. This might explain why the shift group engaged in more defensive inferences that kept them from doing activities that might have supported their learning process. And more importantly, this evidence shows how influential the context is in terms of learning performance. So, in conclusion, answering the first research question, what self-regulated learning behaviors do participants display? Well, the online group was more likely to regulate their environments, and on the other hand, the shift group displayed negative online self-efficacy. The differences between these two groups highlights the major role that context plays in self-regulated learning processes. And none of the participants engage in any kind of self-reflection behaviors. For the second research question, how do participants' self-regulated learning affect their learning processes? Well, first of all, participants displayed distal and vague goals. They also presented a low self-efficacy at work, and they turned to subjective self-evaluation based on achievements that were not workplace-oriented. So what are the pedagogical implications of the present study? Well, first of all, this study tries to provide some information about the Chilean adult learners and their self-regulated behaviors on their additional language learning. So it is hoped that this study might fill just a little the gap found in literature at the beginning of this research. Talking about ESP, ESP is strongly based on language needs assessments, especially of workers, which is usually considered as a highly functional and contextualized subset of English as a foreign or second language. Nevertheless, this study emphasizes the role of ESP teachers, not only for language teaching, but also as guides in terms of how students approach their own learning process. For instance, learners can be given support when they establish their goals. Since, for example, students are not necessarily language experts, they are more likely to set goals that might not help them make their learning process more effective and efficient. So we as teachers can, and up to some extent must, provide that guidance. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I'm going to now allow Valentina to moderate questions for you. There she is.
Yes, we have some questions already. The first one says, how do you think those who lack self-reflection can change this behavior, and how will this affect their learning?
Okay, well, I think I can take into consideration the other question as well, like giving examples of self-reflection. Well, the idea of self-reflection is quite self-explanatory in the way that, for example, students take time to think whether whatever learning effort they have done has been successful or not. For example, what I can mention from the journals is that at the end of every online session, students didn't think about what they were learning was, for example, useful for them, but they usually repeat some actions that were present in previous stages, like, for example, reading notes, or, for example, practicing pronunciation and the like. So the fact that, for example, they're not integrating that knowledge into their workplaces is, in a way, how can you say, is in a way, is a result of not thinking, of not reflecting if whatever they're learning or how they're learning it is useful for their goal orientation, for their workplace objectives. So in that sense, I can say, for example, a good example of self-reflection would be, for example, analyzing goals. For example, setting short-term goals is works as a milestone to know whether whatever I am studying or learning is reaching or is helping me reach my objective or not.
All right, I'm going to jump in. So one of the components of self-regulated learning is what is called metacognition. And what metacognition does is to allow you to plan and self-monitor and self-evaluate. So this metacognitive knowledge is completely different from second language knowledge. And for example, like knowing the grammar rule that you need to put as when the subject is third person singular is second language knowledge, explicit knowledge. But the fact that you know that you have that knowledge is metacognition. So there isn't a lot of research about how to enhance self-regulated learning, but there is a lot of research that looked at ways in which metacognition can be improved, which is called metacognitive instruction. So, for example, in this case, as Sebastian said, one of the things teachers can do is to increase students' metacognition by teaching them how to plan, by teaching them how they monitor their own learning processes, how to set goals for their future, short-term and long-term. And this is completely different and separate from second language teaching, yet it is important for them to acquire so that their second language learning will be enhanced.
Thank you very much. Another question. What types of ESP materials did students use?
Well, in some cases, they were not using ESP materials for the lessons. That's why I mentioned at some point that the contents didn't quite match their needs. In some cases, for example, they were using Oxford materials that was basically made for example, for business context, which was quite useful. But for the most part, they were using just general English course books, for example.
Thank you. We have a comment. It says, self-regulation in any working environment could be neglected if we take into account that employers might be focused on their issues. Their question is, in your opinion and perception, are teachers being neglected when facing their duties? Are they being left alone when facing their courses?
Okay. In my personal opinion and from my own experience, I would say some part of it can be considered as true, especially in terms of dealing with how students approach their own learning. Because most of the time, for example, especially for ESP courses, there is a very goal-oriented approach to it. Like, for example, learners should learn this and then move on to another unit or to another, for example, functional language and the like. But it's not quite involved how their learning is actually helping them to do that. So, for example, something that might learn in the first unit might be completely forgotten once they progress to the second or the third unit. And that's something that you can say is being neglected, not in terms of what teachers do, but how learning is perceived.
I think one of the interesting points or features of this study is that the participants were professionals already. So their motivation is distinct, different from like regular second language learners, university, primary school levels, whatever, that usually researchers investigate. In terms of motivation, it is very different because, you know, in some companies you're required to take courses. In some companies, they're not required to do it, yet they're motivated to do it for their career development. Either way, their type of motivation is different. So this aspect, I think, affects the relationship between the teacher and students, and the teacher can consider that, okay, so these students are not like university students that I used to teach, or high school students that I used to teach.
Thank you. Rodrigo wants to know if you believe in the creation of students' habits and routines as the first step to achieve their goals.
I would say yes, definitely. But more importantly is to teach them how to adapt when is necessary. And that's the idea of self-regulated learning. It's an iterative process that is constantly informing itself. And the thing is, when you create habits, you might run the risk that those habits are not going to be changed in the future. So it is an important step, definitely, but also it's important to make students aware that sometimes it's necessary to make necessary adaptations.
Yes, thank you. We have one more question. It says, you mentioned that some participants mentioned choosing the place where they study and telling people not to interrupt. Did you look into how the participants' environment determines their SRL? If they don't have a physical place to study, does it correlate to your findings in the SRL?
Well, I tapped into that aspect of self-regulated learning, but I didn't study it in depth. But let me take that again. If you don't have a physical place to study, well, what I could collect from the data is that, for example, when participants had other people who live with them, or for example, they didn't have one specific place, or they share that place with other people that were working, for example, at the same time they were taking their classes, that affect the way, for example, how much attention they pay to classes, how comfortable they felt with it, and for example, their own self-evaluation, how good they think they were at learning in those conditions.
So it's like like controlling your mind when it comes to self-regulated learning, and to some extent you can control your learning regardless of the environment, just like Sebastian gave presentation under construction right now. He is aware of it, and yet he's managed to do it. So the similar thing can be said for second language learning as well. Having said that, if you got all the kids running around you, then that's just practically impossible to do anything.
And well, in addition, for example, some participants mentioned that where they were having face-to-face classes, the activity of commuting to one place to another, like helped them to set their minds. Like they were getting ready during they were traveling to their, for example, English Institute to, okay, so I have to start getting ready for learning something. And of course, that was taken away when the pandemic started.
Thank you. And now Paula is going to say something.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. This was a very active room, and it was a very interesting discussion. So we really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Masatoshi and Sebastian, Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation, interesting discussion, and again, the time devoted to researching local practice and local issues. Right now, we are going to close this room, but I need to remind you once again of what we are going to do next. The next thing that we are going to do is we are going to wait all of you to join us in room number 1. I have just left the link here for the closing discussion. So I'm just going to add it here again, that there is the feedback link for you to give us feedback about all the different sessions and how we can make them better. And also